Our study in the book of Exodus continues with Exodus 16 and 17. I've titled the devotion, Jehovah-nissi, the Lord my banner. Would you open your Bible with me to Exodus 16? Now, a brief review. We have considered the faithlessness of the children of Israel who, after the miracle of the Red Sea crossing, turned from celebrating Egypt's defeat to murmuring against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Consider with me then Exodus 16. Notice first of all, daily complaining. Verses 1 through 3. And so in Exodus 15, the people complained about a lack of water, and God provided water. In Exodus 16, they complained about a lack of food when the people left Egypt. They must have packed enough provisions for a month. However, when their supplies were exhausted, they began to murmur against Moses and Aaron. And we read that they complained that they would have been better off dying in Egypt than following Moses into the desert, only to starve and die. Verses 2 and 3. Now, notice how soon they forgot God's miraculous provision of water. The God that could wonderfully provide water in the midst of the desert surely could provide food. And that brings us to verses 4 through 21, what I would describe as daily manna and daily meat. So once again, Moses cried to the Lord, and in verse 4, God responded, and he promised to, quote, rain bread from heaven, sufficient for a day, so that he might, quote, prove the people whether they will walk in my law or no. Now, the Lord promised that on the sixth day he would provide twice the daily manna so that the people might store enough for the Sabbath. Verse 5. And so Moses and Aaron encouraged the people how the Lord would provide them bread in the morning and in the evening flesh to eat. Verses 6 through 8. Moses also taught a spiritual truth that all believers should understand, and God's faithful ministers should remember. And here it is, and I quote, "The Lord heareth your murmurings, which ye murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us," Moses speaking for himself and Aaron. "Your murmurings are against the Lord." Well, faithful to his promise, Quail indeed covered the camp each evening and provided the people with meat. Each morning they found a small round bread they called manna. Verse 15. Moses then instructed the men to gather only enough for their households, every man according to his eating. So gather only enough for your home to eat in one day. In other words, every day to trust that the Lord would provide the food for the day. Moses also admonished in verse 19, "Let no man leave of it till the morning." So don't take up more of what God has provided than you need. There's a wonderful lesson in that. And then we have daily dependence, verses 20 through 31 of chapter 16. And so what lesson did the Lord teach Israel by providing them daily provisions? He taught the people to look to him for their daily needs. And yet, verse 20, some failed to trust the Lord, and they hoarded more manna than they could eat. And what happened? It bred worms and it stank. Literally, it rotted. So there were some among the people that, in spite of the instructions, gather only enough for a day, hoarded what they gathered, coveted it, only to find that it would rot and decay. And so as promised, the day before the Sabbath, now think about this, the Sabbath being the Lord's Day, the day before the Sabbath being Friday, the Lord provided enough for the day and the day after. So on Friday, the Lord would provide enough for Friday and for the Sabbath. Thus the people did not need to seek provisions for the Sabbath. Why? Verse 30, it was the day of rest. Well, closing thought for Exodus 16 before we look briefly at chapter 17. In Exodus 16 is a reminder of God's faithfulness. Moses directed Aaron in verse 33 and 34, take a pot, store manna therein, and lay it up before the Lord to be kept as a lasting testimony. Now we know that pot would ultimately be placed in the ark, which had the covenant. And so it was to be a lasting memorial of what? Of God's daily provision for food. And so the Lord provided Israel for 40 years until, verse 35, they came to a land inhabited. They did eat manna until they came into the borders of the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised. That brings us to Exodus 17. Verses 1 through 7, we have a thirst only God could quench. And so Israel continued her journey in the wilderness of sin and encamped in Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. So now we're back to the lack of water. Once again, the people question, is the Lord among us or not? Verse 7. And once again, they accuse Moses of bringing them out of Egypt to kill them. Well, the criticism became so vicious that we read in verse 4 that Moses feared the people were almost ready to stone him. The Lord then commanded Moses to take the rod he carried when the waters of the Red Sea were divided and stand upon the rock in Horeb and smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. Well, Israel did indeed witness the Lord's compassion and provision for their needs. However, it's interesting that the Gospel of John reveals a greater truth. While the rock in Horeb supplied water to Israel, we learn in the Gospel of John it was a type, a prophetic picture of Jesus Christ. The water that flowed from the rock in Horeb quenched the temporal thirst of Israel. Christ, however, promised he could give water so that a soul might never thirst. For he was, John 4 and verse 14, the well of water springing up into everlasting life. Then notice with me verses 8 through 16, what I would describe as a victory only God could give. Well, after departing Egypt and crossing the Red Sea, the children of Israel encountered their first enemy when the Amalekites, now they were descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, came to war against them. Now Moses summoned Joshua, and Moses commanded Joshua to choose men in Israel to fight with Amalek. Verse 9. While Joshua then led Israel to war in the valley, Moses stood on the top of the hill with the rod of God in his hand. Now we read in verse 11 that when Moses' arms were outstretched, Israel prevailed against Amalek. And still, when his arms grew heavy and the battle went against the nation, finally, sitting down on a rock, Moses' brother steadied one arm. At the same time, a man named Hur held the other aloft. Thus Israel prevailed. And Joshua, discomfited, literally defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Well, a closing thought. Israel's first battle in the wilderness reminded the people that the Lord was on their side. The Lord commanded Moses to write the victory in a book and exhorted him to rehearse it, quote, in the ears of Joshua, verse 14. And then, as a memorial to the victory, we read that Moses built an altar and he called it Jehovah-nissi, which means the Lord is my banner. Wow, what a wonderful story. We will continue this study tomorrow. But for today, we sign off by rejoicing in this. God is not only our daily provision, God is also our banner. He goes to war for his people. May you and I put our faith and trust in him. God bless, and bye-bye.